You might have heard about a recent controversy surrounding the CBC, specifically the one where they broadcasted and published a report on social media and happiness. When it was found that the report the reporting was based off of was highly flawed and spreading misinformation, a complaint was filed against the CBC, requesting that the record be set straight. Where things went off the rails was the CBC responding, specifically saying that it's not their job to fact check things. Yeah, yikes indeed. Well, today you're in for a treat, because the guy that filed the complaint, that was me. So, we're going to go over a bunch of stuff about the CBC scandal and hopefully offer some clarity on things because I have been fielding a lot of questions about this. First, the context. I monitor a lot of different sources, whether it is sources from similar websites to my own or some social media platforms or even the largest media players that operate in Canada and the US. There's nothing really out of the ordinary for a journalist to do that. Sources do happen to come across things I don't immediately catch. After all, there is so much happening in the world, it requires many, many eyes to keep track of it all. Of course, one of the sources I do monitor is the CBC. This is both what they broadcast and what they publish online. It's not comprehensive monitoring, since there are plenty of things I don't catch, but I do monitor things as best I can. So, specifically with the CBC, the quality of coverage varies widely, depending on the topic that is being covered. For instance, the Israel war on the Gaza Strip was actually pretty top-notch coverage. Some people gave them flack for it, but the criticism that I saw was typically in the category of my side of the conflict is better than your side of the conflict, and it's up to the CBC to reflect that. No, that's not their job. Their job is to cover the facts, not say one side is evil and the other side is the good guys. So, if you think I'm one of those guys that just hates on the CBC all the time, well, sorry to disappoint you. That's not what I do. While there are areas of coverage that I consider to be pretty solid, there are other areas that the CBC tends to be pretty abysmal at. That just so happens to be the area that I cover, technology. To be fair here, the CBC is far from the only one to suffer from this problem. Across the board for all major general media outlets, technology has long been an area that the mainstream media frequently has terrible coverage on. So the CBC is far from alone in this, but they are one of the outlets that are notoriously bad in their coverage. There are numerous examples I could cite here. For instance, throughout the 2000s and 2010s, media outlets like the CBC simply regurgitated press releases from organizations like the Recording Industry Association of America and the Motion Picture Association of America. This led to reports falsely claiming that one download means one lost sale, Canada is the #1 source of theater piracy, and so on and so forth. In fact, this specific example is what got me into journalism in the first place. People like me routinely set the record straight on copyright-related issues. What I've generally noticed, however, was that misinformation and technology spread by major media outlets like the CBC has progressively gotten worse. This seems to be in large part thanks to the major media outlets knowing that they are losing audience members to social media. In response, the major media outlets have been running anti-social media campaigns for a long time to try and demonize it as much as humanly possible. This is not to say that social media is without flaws, but mainstream media has long cast aside basic journalistic integrity to routinely launch hit pieces on things like video games and social media for quite some time now. So, what examples have I seen that things are getting worse on this front? For one, the link tax debate, which saw mainstream media falsely argue that linking is stealing. A second one is that AI is a perfect or nearly perfect technology that is on the verge of taking over everyone's jobs. This as the technology has reached sentience. Again, that's not actually true. A third false claim is, of course, that social media is inherently harmful and comparable to smoking. There is a growing body of evidence that has been concluding that social media either has a net neutral impact or a net positive impact. So claims like social media being inherently harmful are false for a number of reasons. To put it simply, major media outlets spreading misinformation and disinformation has been something that has kept me extremely busy for years now. But for the most part, I simply kept reporting and setting the record straight. This, of course, gets me to the lead up to the CBC scandal. In late March of 2026, I noticed a report on the CBC talking about the World Happiness Report. It's one of those stories that, on the surface, just seems like little more than a fluff piece that can be seemingly interesting, but not exactly earth-shattering. In fact, when I started hearing the report, my eyes glazed over and went to the bottom banner to see what else is happening. Then the person delivering the report started talking about social media, which, of course, caught my attention. The claims were that social media is at fault for a decline in overall happiness and that Canada sunk in the rankings because Canadians are heavily using social media. As a real journalist, my journalistic instincts really took over. First of all, the research in this field easily contradicts this. Second of all, social media is a pretty international thing, so why would Canada be specifically impacted by this? So much about this was not adding up in my mind. So I did what a real journalist would do in this situation, begin researching this topic because there is a story here. What I didn't know at the time was that my journalistic instincts were far more correct than I could have ever possibly imagined. So I started digging into the story further. My first question was basically where these claims were coming from. Are these claims coming from the CBC or this World Happiness Report? As it turned out, it was mostly the World Happiness Report, but the claim that Canada fell in the rankings of happiness because of social media was seemingly from the CBC. I dug through the report and couldn't find the part that said that Canada can specifically blame social media for the decline in rankings. The rest, however, was seemingly derived from the report itself. So my next question was, how did this report so heavily deviate from what has long been the scientific consensus on mental health and social media? This is where things start to escalate. As it turned out, the report relied heavily on a very controversial figure in the scientific community, Jonathan Haidt. As some know, Haidt published a book called The Anxious Generation, a book that claims that social media is actively harming people's mental health, especially younger generations. The book itself was widely panned by the scientific community, with some saying that they are shocked that an academic actually wrote this in the first place. While the book itself was widely panned by the scientific community, it was eagerly soaked up by media outlets desperate to find something to criticize social media with. This along with politicians who are upset at how accountable for their actions they have become. As a result, a lot of the moral panic that is spread on major media outlets about social media can be traced back to this book. The thing is, while the figure in question and the book is highly questionable, both of which were used for the making of this report, those weren't the only problems. A number of citations used to bolster the argument of social media harm were traced back to Haidt's own unpublished manuscripts. So, not peer-reviewed research or research that was published by a reputable scientific journal, as far as I can tell. As others have pointed out, many other citations used were to online blog postings, some of which weren't even related to the topic at hand. What's more, the report revolves seemingly entirely around social media as the cause of the decline of world happiness. The chapter headlines and descriptions make no mention of things like poverty, crime, social security, the cost of housing, the cost of living, regional stability, the strength of human rights, and a whole host of other issues that you would think would factor into global happiness. Yet, none of this was apparently worth its own separate chapter. Ultimately, the more you look into this report, the worse and worse it looks. So I did what I normally do and wrote a major report on the flaws found in the reporting and the report itself. This leads me to the complaint. Normally, this is where the story ends. I did a write-up and did my part to set the record straight on this issue. The thing is, there was just something about this whole situation that was just nagging at me. I knew about the CBC Ombudsman, but I never used that resource before. Was it really worth it to go so far as to write a formal complaint to the CBC about them spreading disinformation like this? I mean, I never did in the past with the many other instances of this sort of thing happening, so what would make this any different? Honestly, I spent a couple of days going back and forth on this. The funny thing was that one of my readers also suggested that I think about filing a complaint to the CBC Ombudsman as well. So it turned out it wasn't just me thinking about this. What ultimately got me to file the complaint was this. If I don't file the complaint, I'm basically giving the CBC a free pass and misleading readers into believing something that is obviously inaccurate. While every other correspondence I have ever made since starting Freezenet has gone unanswered, what's one more message that's going to go unanswered? If anything, it would make for a good story about how I put my money where my mouth was and did my part in holding the CBC accountable. So that's what I chose to do. I filed a complaint and published that complaint on my website afterwards. Now, obviously, there is a difference between being abusive and offering constructive criticism. What's more, it is entirely possible that reporters of the CBC were unfamiliar with the other side of the story. So I crafted the complaint in such a way as to point out what was problematic about the report, offering evidence to say that the World Happiness Report was flawed, pointing to other people making the same criticism, and pointing out why Haidt is not exactly the most credible person in this area of scientific research. Now, one of the things I knew would happen if I left it as that is the CBC would say that this is just opinions, and CBC does not cover such opinions. They would likely say that there is no evidence to back these opinions up. So, I backed up my opinions with actual scientific evidence, covering 7 studies that came to conclusions that contradict the World Happiness Report. In short, not only is it false to say that social media is inherently harmful, but researchers have gotten to the point of saying that it's the coverage of this supposed epidemic of social media-induced mental health problems that is actually causing more harm than social media itself. So this is what I asked the CBC. Cover both sides of the story. If the CBC is of the personal opinion that social media is harmful, fine. But at least talk about the other side that points out that social media is not inherently harmful. At minimum, acknowledge that this is a debate. If the CBC is not familiar with this side of the debate, maybe do a follow-up and talk about this angle of the story. I'm not asking for the moon here, but rather actually do what the job is supposed to be as a journalist and do some basic fact-checking and research before publishing an article. I believe that their coverage violates either their accuracy or fairness rules. In short, do better, people. Now, to the response I got. I honestly wasn't expecting much of a response out of all this. Probably just a short screw-off response from some butthurt manager, if that. What I got was a response that was much worse than I could have possibly imagined. So, without further ado, this is the response I got that really blew this story up. Thank you for your email to the CBC Umbud copied below regarding recent coverage of the 2026 World Happiness Report that was published on cbcnews.ca. I am the Senior Director of Journalistic Standards and Public Trust for CBC News, responding on behalf of the General Manager and Editor-in-Chief, Brodie Fenlon. I appreciate that you have taken the time to express your concerns about our journalism, and I would welcome the opportunity to address them. After reviewing the coverage in question, I believe our reporting met the requirements of our Journalistic Standards and Practices, JSP. The report of this coverage was to report on the release and findings of the World Happiness Report itself, a significant annual publication from the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. When CBC News reports on such a matter, our duty is to fairly and accurately report on the conclusions reached by the authors of this study. In this instance, the report authors identified a decline in youth happiness in North America and pointed towards social media and increased social isolation as significant contributing factors. These were the findings of the study's authors, as reported, not conclusions endorsed by CBC News. Regarding your concerns about the methodology of the World Happiness Report and its reliance on the work of Jonathan Haidt, it is important to distinguish between reporting a news event and conducting a comprehensive scientific review of that study's citations and conclusions. Our reporting does not imply that the CBC has conducted an independent peer review of the hundreds of pages of research. Rather, it signifies that the report's release is a matter of significant public interest that warrants coverage. Thank you again for your feedback, which has been shared with CBC News editorial leaders, and for your engagement with our journalism. Sincerely, Bassem Bashra. I gotta tell you, my jaw hit the floor when I read that. Basically, what I got was this. Listen, dude, you might get some crazy notion that we go around fact-checking everything all day long, but that's not our job, okay? We essentially rewrote a press release put out by some guy and called it a day. If that guy's paper is wrong, we really could care less. We could also care less about actual scientific research. Your piddly little 7-study meta-analysis is meaningless to us. So take your stupid little facts and pound sand, loser. Oh yeah, you better believe I was going to copy and paste that fun little response onto my website afterwards. For reasons that should be pretty obvious, the response went viral. My website got a pretty sizable traffic spike shortly after that got published. The response from the CBC was absolutely horrible and very antithetical to what journalism is about. I simply asked them to offer better reporting on the subject, and they rejected it outright as basically a waste of time and effort. This while defending the practice of publishing very shoddy and lazy reporting. So I spent a good portion of my days fielding questions about this whole insane affair. So I thought I'd also go over some of the big themes I noticed with these questions. Think of this as a bit of an FAQ here. Question: did you really expect the CBC to conduct a thorough peer-reviewed research paper on social media and mental health? This is something both the CBC and some people who claim I didn't read things correctly typically say. The irony here is that both are failing basic reading comprehension of what I actually said. Nowhere in my complaint did I ask them to conduct a scientific peer-reviewed research paper on this subject. I never expected them to do that, which is why I never asked. If anything, I actually did the legwork for them. All they had to do was skim through the articles in question and learn that there is scientific evidence out there that says that social media is not inherently harmful, and say, hey, there's research papers out there saying that social media is not inherently harmful. Maybe this is a matter of debate. As I found out with the response from the CBC, even that was apparently way too much to ask for. Question: is it fair to characterize the letter as an abandonment of fact-checking? In my opinion, yes, it still is. While the letter doesn't explicitly state it, it implies the CBC is rejecting the practice of fact-checking, at least in this case. So let me walk you through the thought process of such an everyday event for a journalist. You get this paper via press release sent through an email. What a real journalist would do is say, oh hey, this seems to be like an interesting topic to write about. Let's do some research on this. So you'd ask questions like, is Haidt a credible researcher? What do other research papers in the past say about this topic? Are there mental health experts I can talk to about this? You know, questions like that. From there, you would do some basic queries about the subject, gather the facts, and while you wait for a response or a comment, pore over what the findings of the paper was talking about and get a feel for what the paper is actually saying. Then, when you get your results and additional findings, you put together your report. You might say things like, the report said this. We asked experts on this field for their thoughts on these findings. Also, other reports have come to different conclusions about social media and mental health, so this appears to be a matter of debate. That, to me, is fact-checking. Now, could you have a debate of just how far you're going to go with this fact-checking? Sure. Different reporters will have different time constraints and different levels of interest on how far they're willing to take things. That is the nature of the business. Could you run into different levels of quality when it comes to facts? Yes, that happens. Still, at least do some surface level digging beyond the findings of the report. This is something that the CBC, by their own admission, explicitly chose not to do. Instead, they just did a quick and dirty, this is the report found, and left it at that. They said that this report might be a matter of public interest, rewrote the press release, concluded that it was a fair reading of the findings, and left it at that. This is a practice I have long termed as journalism by press release. And as a real journalist, this practice drives me nuts. If you wonder why some stories comes off as merely advertising masquerading as news, a part of the problem is this very practice. I also blame this practice as being a contributing factor for transforming the media landscape from an institute that holds politicians and the powerful to account to acting as merely a bully pulpit for politicians and the powerful. This is a practice that really needs to stop if news organizations want to try and restore the trust of the general population. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. Anyway, this is why I concluded that this letter ultimately was a rejection of fact-checking. They actually chose not to check the facts before publishing, and even went so far as to reject the facts after it was handed to them on a silver platter by yours truly. I'm not saying that they never fact-check, but in this case, they're telling me that they don't want to check the facts, even after being presented with the facts. Question: why are you so angry about all this anyway? This is a multi-layered thing for me personally. I spent a long time fact-checking different stories and doing the job of what journalists at large news organizations should be doing. This as opposed to what large outlets were doing, which is push messaging and simply not caring about what the facts say. This was especially problematic during the link tax debate. During that debate, Liberal MP Lisa Hefner launched a smear campaign. This by calling online news outlets, quote, opinion only and not news. While Hefner later apologized for her outrageous comments, it ultimately exposed in plain sight what the established power's view is on online outlets, including mine. That is that online news outlets are the enemy, and they will smear them however they can because politicians, working in lockstep with major media outlets, are trying to stamp out the competition for news and information however they can. The Hefner scandal was not a one-off incident either. In 2024, another journalist working for mainstream media argued that the problem with democracy today is the existence of free speech. So, in order to restore democracy, Canada needs to do away with all free speech. I mean, never mind the fact that journalism depends on a healthy regime of free speech, but yeah, doing away with free speech is something they have actively championed. Then, starting late last year and continuing to this day of this recording is, of course, the CBC's notorious Choose News, Not Noise advertising campaign. The thrust of this is that journalism is in decline, and as that happens, the internet fills the void and spreads rumors and misinformation. Us online journalists have had to face a constant barrage of defamation and slander from major mainstream media outlets for years now. This with the false accusations that everything we produce is false and everything they produce is fact-checked and accurate. While the CBC long claimed to be a news organization that is trusted and accountable, when actual accountability appears in their inbox, as was clearly the case here, they, along with their supporters, get angry at us for daring to ask for basic journalistic standards. It is pure hypocrisy on the part of the CBC. Another layer is the rejection of learning in science. As an actual journalist, a big part of my role is personally learning as much as possible so I can better deliver the news to you. You grow as a journalist not just with your craft and writing, but also in expanding your overall knowledge of the world. So to have a major news organization reject an opportunity to learn from their mistakes and learn more about the subject that they are covering is, from a professional level, extremely frustrating. If they want to know why people think of them as untrustworthy, well, they just showed why. Further, science is an expansion of human knowledge. It's about questioning the world around us and having that curiosity to learn why things are the way they are. This is an extremely compatible mindset to journalism because journalism is also about being curious about the world and finding out what is really going on. So to receive that rejection of science in the journalism community is something that also makes my blood boil. Then there is a layer of professionalism. I continue my role as a journalist as a way of expressing to the world that journalism can, in fact, be done better. I believe in the power of journalism to make society a better place. If I didn't believe that, I would never have chosen journalism as a long-term career for myself. So when I see such an asinine response from the CBC, I know deep down inside that this is truly not what journalism is about. It indirectly tarnishes my reputation as a journalist because independent journalism is often seen as an inferior version of journalism from the major media outlets. That is not true, but that is sometimes how it is perceived by some members of the public. If major media outlets are dropping the ball this hard, then people jump to the conclusions that people like me are dropping the ball even harder and are ultimately not worth the time of day. Again, not true. Not in the slightest. And one of the reasons why I attempted to hold the CBC accountable. Then there is the reader side of things. People are going to read the original report and conclude that social media is extremely harmful. These are not accurate conclusions, but conclusions that an average person might come to when reading that report. This is the damaging implication of misinformation and disinformation being published on major media outlets. The CBC harmed the public at large by publishing this piece. As a result, people are going to start jumping to all sorts of crazy conclusions, such as how social media is comparable to smoking, or social media is ruining their lives. This despite the comparison to smoking being false and the impacts that social media has on their personal lives being, well, benign in a vast majority of the time. That, to me, is a real tragedy in all this. I could go on, but those are some of the ways in which I get upset about this. What the CBC did here is not a representation of professional journalism, and I believe I have every right to call it out, not just for the sake of seeing better coverage on the CBC, but for my own sake as well. Anyway, I think that about covers things for now. I don't know about making a part 2 here, but if something comes up that justifies something like that, I'll probably make a part 2. For now, though, I think I'll leave it there and assess things. Thank you for watching. If you want to support this journalistic effort, there are plenty of ways you can do so. You can subscribe to the channel, drop us a like, or support us through Patreon and Ko-fi. You can also check out my website at freezenet.ca. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next one.